Welcome to Dancing with Water. I'm your host, Teresa Widman. I'm joined by my co host, Jennifer Mulak, and today we get to speak with Perdita Finn. Let me introduce you to Perdita. She is the co founder with her husband, Clark Strand, of the Farrell Fellowship, The Way of the Rose, which inspired their book, The Way of the Rose, The Radical Path of the Divine Feminine Hidden in the Rosary. They are currently at work on their next book, Together, Circles, Not Lines, Spiritual Community Beyond Patriarchy. And we'll link to all of that work at wayoftherose.org in the show notes. In addition to extensive study with Zen masters, priests, spirit workers, and healers, Perdita apprenticed with the psychic Susan Saxman, with whom she wrote The Reluctant Psychic. Perdita now teaches popular workshops on getting to know the dead. Participants are empowered to activate the miracles in their own lives with the help of their ancestors and recover their own intuitive magic. Her book, Take Back the Magic, Conversations with the Unseen World, is an intimate journey through her recovery of those lost ways. She speaks widely on how to collaborate with those on the other side, on the urgent necessity of new romantic animism, and on the sobriety that emerges when we claim the long story of our souls. Her next book is Mothers of Magic, Summoning the Wisdom of Our Ancestors, which will be released on May 5th, 2026. And we're going to center our conversation on that book and some of the themes that it brings out for us. So it's so nice to be back with you, Perdita, and really feels like a nice balm to everything that I've been moving through with what's been going on for us in the world lately. So the balm being that to talk about mothers and mothering and what that might do to help us through.
You know the one thing I wanna say up front that I think it's important for me to clarify, and I clarify this at the very beginning of the book, that the very word mother needs to be recovered in its fullness and dimensionality, not as a gendered term and not as a biologically determined term. In this book, I look at what it meant and to be a mother before civilization, what it has come to mean within it, and what it might mean after it. And clearly before it, it was a term that was not tied to a gendered relationship, an idea of biological determinism. It was an expression of not only who everybody was in a community, but who the earth was to us, who the plants were, who the animals were. To be a soul was to be a mother. And sometimes I say that my work is about learning to see with the eyes of the dead. And to see with the eyes of the dead is to recover that lost vision that we are, in one lifetime or another, all each other's mothers. And that's a transformative vision if we can open our hearts to it.
It's interesting to hear you say that about its mothering is non-gendered, and I'll just insert this into the conversation, but it's this topic, Jennifer and I are doing this show, really that's about embodying the feminine, and we struggle to impart this idea that the feminine is not a woman-centered embodiment. Like it's not you don't have to be a woman. It doesn't mean, that we're talking about women, although there is a lot of overlap between feminine and women. But we're really trying to take it out of its genderization and expand it beyond that. And so I wonder if you could just reflect on what you hear from folks when you talk about taking the mother out of that gendered role. How are people receiving that?
Here we are in end stage patriarchy in a horrific ecocidal moment where everyone is very, very frightened. And so talking about some of these things can feel very, very volatile, right? Because everyone feels like they're under attack for one reason or another, right? Certain people feel like they're under attack for being women. Some people feel like they're under attack for wanting to be women, right? Like everybody is so scared and so frantic. And one of the things my work is about doing is kind of centering ourselves in the ancient perspective of our mothers, which is very, very different than this kind of assertion of a narrow identity. So, people often say, "Who are you?" They ask me to introduce myself. And I say, well, today I'm remembering that I have been a hemlock tree, I have been a seal, I am often a black bear, and I am a human being struggling to remember what it means to be an animal in this world and to live within my animal body. Um, the mother's way before civilization did not condemn us to the merciless injustice of a single life. One of the reasons people are so terrified is they think they've only got one life to get it right, one life to make a mark, one life to matter. And most people feel like they don't matter. They can't make a mark. And they're going to disappear into the dust of time. But what if you had all the time in the world? And what if the truth was that we have all been men and women and 36 different genders of fungi? And we held that all within us. What if the truth was that we've all been trees and plants and weeds? What if we've been the hero, the victim, and we've also been the villain? The incredibly misunderstood teacher, Yeshua of Nazareth, once said in the Gospel of Thomas, "Be passerby, be no one." And what I think he was trying to get us to embrace, he was the leader of a mystery cult, was the radical mystery of who we are and who we are to each other. If I have one creed, it's I don't know. I do know love, and I do know that I am called to radical empathy. But beyond that, I don't know who I am. I know that who I have been has given me traumas, but it's also given me treasures. And so how do I stay awake to one and activate the other? That's why I say that the cure for patriarchy isn't simply changing our pronouns or turning God into goddess. It's about a radical revolution of our entire belief sphere. We have to turn the straight line of historical time into the circular wisdom of the long story of our souls. It's a big answer.
Yeah, and I don't know if there's an easy answer to this question to follow up on that, but it does make me think because, I've been talking about the antidote to the patriarchy for, 8 years on my radio show, and I and so I've thought about what it is that we can do to unravel that. And I think that this show that Jennifer and I are doing is an attempt to try to sort of inspire a different way of thinking, embodying, relating. But what do you offer to folks as inspiration or as a curiosity for them to begin to step into an action or a way of being that is that dismantling of the patriarchy?
So, Richie Havens sang at Woodstock, "Sometimes I feel like a motherless child." And civilization is a motherless child. And we've just seen what motherless looks like right now. Motherless looks like men so radically ecocidal and suicidal and homicidal that they are trying to annihilate their wives and their lovers, right? It's not even sex, it's not even death, it's just extinction. It's just nihilism to the nth degree, pornographic nihilism. And that's civilization from the get-go, Teresa. That's not something that can be reformed. That's not something that can be fixed. Since the get-go, civilization's been trying to reform itself. And I think, my book looks at historical. We think this is what we are. I was just in a rather unpleasant conversation with a man 2 weekends ago who's asserting to me that violence was human nature. Violence is human nature. And what he was really saying is my violence is my right. you know, I have a right to be violent. And he doesn't. And in fact, we see no evidence of human violence. None. Before 8 to 6,000 BC. We see it the first time we see even evidence of a murder is among the Natufians in the Middle East about 7,000 years ago. And there's no evidence of misogyny, rape, war, slavery, or murder before agriculture, before we stop moving around. In fact, what you see is a cooperative, collaborative, artistic culture. People think that civilization has brought us the arts. And in fact, it's just the opposite. Civilization has almost destroyed the arts. Before we had civilization, before we were living in these hierarchical systems of domination devoted to this agricultural production and this devastation of the land and this devastation of women, we hunted and gathered. We followed the herds, we followed the seasons. We worked about 2 hours a day. We ate an incredibly diverse diet. We were incredibly healthy. We made a lot of art. The best painting that's ever been done was done 30,000 years ago in the caves at Chauvet and then Dordon. You know what I mean? Like I've been there. I've stood in those caves and watched them by candlelight come alive. They're like moving images. It's like this ecstatic art. They're musical instruments that are 40,000 years old that are exquisite. We have stories that have survived for over 60,000 years. The story of the Pleiades, the story of Cinderella, believe it or not. So we had culture, lots of culture, and no violence. And then something goes wrong between 10,000 BC and 6,000 BC. What goes wrong? We start to develop these sedentary communities that are devoted to growing and harvesting grain. It's such a weird transition, and many different theorists have posited why we gave up this really radically ecstatic lifestyle for this really horrific life of toil. We see this in the Bible, right? Adam and Eve are condemned to a life of toil, of the domestication of animals and the domestication of plants, because Eve was bad, this is what happens. But in fact, if we look at the record, uh, it's interesting to wonder what happens. Was it climatological pressure from ice ages, from meteor descents? There are a lot of different theories. Another theory is that somehow we were domesticated by the grains. There's a Harvard theorist who believes that it's not we who domesticated the grains, but the grains who domesticated us for world domination. It's the corn, the wheat, the barley, and the rice that have taken over the world, that are really in charge of Monsanto. I had this vision of writing I'm not a very good novelist, but of writing a sci-fi novel about the grain gods who've taken over the world, and they have. And what is clear is they made us drunk. They got us drunk. And the first act of this drunken species that we see evidence of is in the oldest story in the world, a story that's much older than the biblical story. It's called the Enuma Elish. It comes from Sumer, the culture. There it is, those first city-states. And it details a grandson, Marduk, a god, who will become Yahweh, murdering his grandmother, who is the goddess of chaos and of the oceans that you cannot control, the oceans where life comes from. He splits her like a shellfish, and he divides her and organizes her body into pieces. And that organization of the goddess of chaos is actually, named Tiamat, is actually enshrined in Genesis in the opening lines when God comes down and separates the dark from the light and makes order of the world. It's really a description of the evisceration of the grandmother goddess who's disappeared at the beginning of the Bible. And the disappearance of the grandmothers, most of whom we don't know the names of a lot of these grandmother goddesses, they were so effectively disappeared. And if we look, one of the really interesting questions I have is what happens when a species loses its grandmothers and the power of our grandmothers. And if you look at elephants or orcas, the teenage boys go crazy. If you have elephants running wild in Africa or India, the way to get them to calm down is to bring in the grandmother elephants. And if you have orcas going out of control, you got to bring in the grandmother orcas. So it's been posited. There's a marvelous book called Bitch by Lucy Cook. It's called On the Female Species. I mean, a lot of what I'm fascinated by nature as a teacher. Do you know what I mean? Like, it's really interesting. Is you got to have the grandmothers in charge, or the male adolescent power gets disorganized. You know, there's a great feminist writer writing right now called Katie Mann, who I love. She's writing on Substack. She's been writing about Epstein, everything. She's superbly thoughtful. And, she says, we are frightened of men in groups. I don't want to hear about men's empowerment groups. They're just frats by another name. I don't care if you're drumming. I don't care if you're taking ayahuasca. I want to hear about men sitting down with old women to remember who they are.
That's a very radical approach, yet there's something just, um, ironic or coincidental with it, and that my my father's mother, my grandmother on my father's side, is passed, and I have been struggling with my own male child and his very explosive energy. And probably because I was reading your book, I was really thinking, like, who of my ancestors should I call upon for help? And it just struck me as funny. I'd never seen it before, although it's a clear fact. My grandmother had 6 boys. And it just made me think, well, she's the one that I need to be asking. Although I'm not sure, how she raised her boys, because that was a long time ago and there was a different way of raising boys. But it just made me think that she's the one on the other side who's going to help me understand that. And so it's very interesting to hear about the grandmother relationship.
Well, I'll, I'll tell you about 2 stories, and I think it's important to remember. First of all, the greatest mother at the center of my book is a young man, a rock climbing expert, who taught me what it was to have a mother. And the greatest gift of mothering I ever received was from a 22-year-old man. And I think it's important that I have a son who's one of the great mothers in the world. One of the great things I was gifted is when he was a young boy, when he was about 10, he had a teacher at Woodstock Elementary School who was a genius at teaching boys. She'd been a teacher for 30 years, and she was about to retire. Her name was Donna Albright. I love her, one of the great mothers in the world. And she had this group of really high-powered boys, my son and a couple of his friends. And, they were high energy, high smarts, and high mischief, right? And she had them in 3rd grade, and she knew that boys needed to move. And she would move them every 20 minutes. They'd be outside. They were making stuff. They were doing stuff. And she loved them so much, and she could work with their energy. Do you know what I mean? Like, she wasn't trying to confine them in seats and make them. I mean, the interesting thing is how elementary school privileges girls, but middle and high school privileges boys. There's a lot written about this much more wisely than I can talk about. Anyway, she was one of the great mothers. She ended up staying. She ended up saying she wouldn't retire if she could stay with these boys for 3 years, which
Wow.
she did. And I want to tell you, they're all wonderful, wonderful young men. And I really credit her. I really credit her. She was a great mother in the world. But, you know, we need grandmother wisdom. When I first met my husband, we were going on our first date in New York City, and we met on the corner of Broadway to go to a movie. So we're gonna get on the subway to go to a movie, and we're crossing Broadway, and there's traffic everywhere, and the lights are changing, and everybody's honking, and we're standing in this little island of traffic about to cross into the next onslaught to the subway, and he looks at me and he stops and he says, "I need to tell you something before we go any further." And I think, "Oh god, I hate dating New York," like, "Oh my god, what's it gonna be?" What horrible revelation is about to emerge from his mouth? You know? And he says, "I need to tell you that I was raised by a group of women who adored me." I was so startled. I mean, this was the strangest thing I'd ever heard. I didn't know what to say. I hadn't expected it. I'd never heard anyone say anything like this. I was very used to men who hated their mothers, and I knew wanting to get away from them. But to say I was raised by a group of women who adored me, and so not knowing what to say, I said, "Well, tell me about these women who adored you." And he began to tell me about his grandmother, and he began to tell me about his old aunts, and he began to tell me about his great grandmother, and he began to tell me about the old nanny who lived behind the house. And he started to talk and talk about these women, and I realized he was a man who loved women, and he loved the company of women, and he relished old women. And I realized by the time we got out of the subway that I was safe.
I don't I feel like I draw upon my own experiences parenting a lot in these conversations, and so I don't mean to distract it in any way, but it
Oh, no.
it I think it relates because your book is clearly about mothering, and you talk about your own mothers and mother figures, and I'd love to hear more about the rock climbing incident too. So we'll come back to that. But the I am consistently doubting, I think, the way of mothering, um, because when you have a a very lively wild child, right? There is often society's expectations that you must control him. You must control your child. And I I understand that there is, within, reason, some element of containment, right? There can't be just complete wild behavior that's dangerous. But it is always something that I'm coming back to and having to consistently reinforce for myself. And so it's interesting that this notion, and I maybe just to be clear, this notion that um, there's this phrase "firm but kind" is sort of what comes to mind when it comes to parenting. So there's this doubt that 10 years down the road, I'll be realizing I did something wrong, or I'll find out I did it the right way because I was loving and nurturing and motivating instead of controlling. So to hear you talk about Clark and his relationship to the women in his life gives me some comfort that intuitively the way that I want to mother is the right way. It's just that it's not always the most common way or the most publicly accepted way. And so that's a little bit of a segue just to hear what you think the attributes of mothering are that you are wanting to encourage and inspire in others.
Every mother within civilization is designed to fail. You will fail. I failed. And you've been set up for failure, and you've been set up for blame. And to counteract that is gonna be really, really hard, and I wanna talk about what the situation is and how to counteract it. First of all, no one person can give any other being enough mothering. Mothering is a collective, collaborative activity of a group of people, not the work of an individual. This is what you see in the ancient world. not only from the get-go, a woman might give birth to a child in a hunter-gatherer community, and many women will nurse that child. Women who haven't had babies yet will lactate and nurse that child. Women who are postmenopausal will nurse that child. They can still lactate if they need to. Men's breasts will serve as suckling agents for that child. What do you think they're for? Men can't figure it out in this culture because they can't imagine serving as mothers. That child may not even know who their biological mother is because mothering is what the community does. So, and imagine a child able to be in a circle of protection rather than guarded by one person with only two eyes. What happens? We send off our children, 25 kids in a kindergarten class with one adult. We ought to send off 3 kids with 25 adults circling them. The entire structure of our culture is designed to make children feel that they don't have enough mothering. And there is no way you can possibly give your child enough mothering. So what's the solution in end-stage patriarchy to this horror shit show that we're inside? Forgive my language, but it's a shit show. We talked at the beginning about this rape website, Motherless, right? Are they talking about the fact that the women they can rape are motherless and they can rape them because they are motherless? That if their mothers were there, they couldn't rape them? Or are they writing from the depth of their own wounding that they are motherless and they're enraged at the feminine that they're so motherless that this is what they're doing to the feminine? I don't know, but I know that everybody is suffering from a lack of mothering. Every one of us, my own children included. How do we get the mothering we need? This is a question I've asked since I gave birth to my own daughter 32 years ago. And I felt so isolated, so overwhelmed, so suddenly like, oh my God, I have been set up, right? I have been set up. That's when I began calling on the dead, Teresa. In the darkness. I began calling on my dead grandmothers. I began calling on my dead teachers. I began calling on dead animals and dead trees. I began calling on roadkill. I began calling on every soul on the other side I could possibly summon. And I began saying, help me feel enough mothering that I can offer mothering to my children. And the mothering that I began offering to my children was the dead. You have more mothers than you can ever know on the other side. You have mothers from past lives who love you. You have seal mothers and hemlock tree mothers and mountain mothers and mothers from other lives. And these aren't archetypes or symbols or constructs. I'm talking, you really have them. And if you call on them and say, I need help, they will show up and you will begin to feel mother. That's the basis of all of my writing, all of my work that links all of my projects together. The dead are real. The dead remember that we are all each other's mothers. And if we call on them for help, they'll show up. But we have to call for help. And what do we teach children in civilization? Cry it out. We put babies in cribs and teach them not to cry. What other animal does that with its young?
Yeah, and that's a good example of where, you know, going to spend the summer with my parents, and I am still sleeping in bed with my almost 4-year-old because we didn't have him cry it out, and, um,
We
that's
had
I just
family bed till my daughter was 11 and my son.
yeah, and that I just, I'm over it now. Every time I'm confronted by the glare from, some external person, um I get a little bit more confidence within myself, that I just should continue to trust my own way. But I think that it's conversations like this, and it's conversations that are inspired by your writing that I think can help folks not feel alone in doing something different and being different. And I guess just to understand or to summarize, not that mothering can be summarized, but what are some of the, like, I hear you talk about um when you're calling upon your mothers, whether it's a ancestral mother, a past life mother, a tree mother, a animal mother, that it's about them coming when you call. But how do you describe what you're
Mm.
actually looking for when you're looking for that mothering experience?
Okay, there's 3 ways my kids call me, and I love it when they call. Nothing makes me happier than to see their name on my phone. My children are 32 and 29, and I am thrilled when they call. Sometimes they're calling for a recipe. Fabulous. I'd love to tell you the recipe, and either cooking for themselves or sharing a recipe, fun. Sometimes they're calling because they need money, and it's nice to be able to give it to them, right? Sometimes they're calling because they need me to listen, and I love to listen. So there's no limit on that request with me, right? There's no limit. But I do love being called. I love being called. And the dead are no different. The dead live being called. Sometimes we call because we're praying that the car payment is not going to be as much as we thought, or our taxes aren't going to be as much as we thought, or I'm going to make it through this month with enough money in the bank. I've made that prayer so many times. I've experienced my father as a mother showing up for me, my mother as a mother showing up for me. Recently, I had a dental problem and I called on my childhood dentist and I experienced him as a mother showing up for me. He made the dental experience not terrible. So there's no limit except our own courage and being honest and authentic about our desire and our need. We're taught not to need anything. I mean, I tell people to start with the smallest asks, the smallest, safest acts. We build faith. And what we're really talking about is faith. So you start building faith one small ask at a time. So I say, oh, please, please don't let my taxes be as much. I want to be able to pay my taxes. Daddy, please help me. Please, please, please. Daddy, you cut me out of my will. Please help me have enough money for my taxes. And suddenly it's way less than I thought. And I'm grateful. That's a miracle. It's not a technicolor dance in the stars. It's an ordinary exhale. And I say, thanks, Dad. That was really helpful. And then a few weeks ago, when it seemed like our out of control leaders were actually considering using nuclear weapons, and I felt psychotic with rage and terror, I thought, what do I do? I sat down and I began calling on the dead from Hiroshima and Nagasaki. And I began calling on the dead who had died from the testing of those bombs. And I began praying to each and every one of them, seeing their shadows burned into the pavement at Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and saying, please, please let these weapons never be used again. So I can go from a simple ask about my taxes to a giant ask about the state of the world, but both with tremendous specificity. Mm. And the specificity is the power. And my faith in the dead is very, very real. And how it becomes real, we think it's going to be a heroic dose of some psychotropic, drug that's going to turn us into enlightened beings. Most enlightened beings I've met aren't married to their first wives. I say, show me a Zen master married to his first wife. I'll show you enlightenment. Anyway, but you know what I mean? Like there's this heroic idea of the transformative moment that we're going to have spiritually. Then I will believe the sun will crash open. I'll have a near-death experience. Something will change. But real faith, the faith of our grandmothers, is grown day by day, prayer by prayer, ask by ask. And it's grown from women who are figuring out how to feed children when there's no money, how to get through a day when there's no hope. You know what I mean? These are the people. You wanna learn about prayer, don't go to the rich, go to the poor coming over the border holding nothing but their rosary beads. They know about prayer is the only thing they've got to hold on to. You know, we live in an economy of money, and so the prayer of the economy of money is, "Let me win the lottery," right? And then I'll think about what I want. The really radical thing is to start thinking about what we want now and begin living in the economy of gift giving that is mothering. Mothering is the gift giving. When you really start to live in this economy, you realize that the entire earth is your mother gifting you each day, gifting you each moment. Every bite of food you eat is a mother who is feeding you. Jesus says, take, eat, this is my body. And we treat it as this kind of singular act of deity. And in fact, it's what every single being in the natural world says to every other being. Take, eat, this is my body. It's what a mother says to her child. You know, part of living in that belief sphere of the mother is remembering the ecological reality that everything eats each other. Mothers feed their children with their bodies. I wish when I died, I could have my body taken out in the woods and be food for vultures and the coyotes who I love, right? And you know, when people used to call themselves the reindeer people or the salmon people or the bear people, this wasn't some precious little totemic identification. They meant when a grandmother died, she would come back as a salmon to literally feed for people. There's a remarkable story. I tell this again and again. I read it in an anthropological book in the 1950s. So it's a story about this anthropologist going out with, these hunters on an elephant hunt. And when the oldest hunter is eating the elephant, he begins to weep uncontrollably. And the anthropologist asks him why. And he says, because until I tasted her, I did not know this elephant was my wife. And what he's saying is, this is to live in an ecological reality, which is we are all literally returning to each other. And the elephant who was his wife will feed his granddaughter, whose body will grow his wife returned to the community as a young child. Do you understand? And when I say that the mother's way is a completely different belief sphere, if we knew that every plant and animal was our mother, would we irradiate them with pesticides to put them in factory farms? No, no. Would we drop bombs on another nation if we knew those children were our mothers and our children? No.
There was a very poignant part in your book, and I was gonna ask you if you wanted to read it or if you want me to read it. Begins on page 175, sort of halfway down there.
The image of the mother that patriarchy has cultivated as surely as a genetically modified crop, resistant to pests and drought, chemically toxic, and lacking in essential nutrients, is selfless, sentimental, and unattainable. That idealized mother is the womb with no desire, the giver who needs nothing, the suppliant, the slave, and ultimately the scapegoat. She is also, most importantly, isolated and alone. Whether she is a trad wife making her own sourdough bread or a harried executive rushing the kids to daycare, she never has enough hands, enough time, enough help. She is always failing. She has been engineered to fail so that the blame for all of our patriarchal problems can be laid at her feet. But what if our presidents and leaders remembered that they were mothers, not of these people or those people, but all peoples, all beings? What if our generals and soldiers saw themselves as mothers of every soul on the other side? What if our prison guards and police officers knew they were the mothers of all those behind bars? What if our CEOs and CFOs knew they were the mothers of trees, of birds, of bees, of fish, of rare minerals hidden in the womb of the earth? Would we even need or want politicians and armies and corporations anymore? What if we're what if it were each of our callings to recover the memories of ourselves as mothers? What if boys became men when they became mothers? What if everyone in our circles were motherly? What if there weren't one beleaguered mother to meet all of our needs, either human or divine, but a world filled with mothers who have always loved us? And that's the message of my book. Go back in any culture, and you find not one god, but many mothers. The 9 mothers of the Kogi people of Colombia, the 9 Icelandic goddesses who give birth to God, the 9 muses in Greece who precede all the other gods, the 9 manifestations of Durga in India. You know, I was on a radio show and someone asked me, why 9? Think, it's amazing that we have to even ask that question. It tells us how divorced we are from the mother's way. And Kuan Yin, the goddess of the compassion, has 1,000 hands because the mothers always want more mothers in the room. At the pyramid is somebody at the top, and the circle is everybody holding hands.
The question that comes up for me is, do we have d is there a role for us to help men become mothers? My impulse is to say, how do we help men become others? And so I want to take a step back and say, is that something that we should be doing? And I'm just curious to know what you think about that.
Well, first of all, in the wake of Me Too, the Epstein files, for which no one's been held accountable, right? This horrific motherless, website, the Giselle Pellicot trial in France. Right now, we have a responsibility to keep women safe. Number one, if 2 children, I just got a new puppy, 2 dogs meeting each other, my dog and my daughter's dog meeting each other. First priority is safety of the dogs, not to let one dog hurt another dog, right? I am less interested right now in the emotional needs of men, and I am more interested in seeing them creating zones of safety for women right now. And I want to be fierce about that. Okay, right now we are in a catastrophic moment. And it's going to take I am watching the men who are stepping up to make women feel safe, seen, and protected. And they're not a lot of them. Okay, and they're not a lot of them. They're not nearly enough of them. So my concern right now is to say, you step up. My job is not how to make men feel safe in this moment emotionally. My job is to make women feel a minuscule amount of physical safety in this culture. Number one. Number 2, I'm a mother of a son, and I have a radical responsibility to have a lot of intimate conversations with him, which I do. He's a wonderful, I'm really proud of him. I'm crazy proud of him. He is, he is an organic farmer. He is a cat mama. He is a big mama in the world. But I keep a close eye on him. I'm tough. I'm tough on my husband. I'm tough on the men I know right now. And what do men need? I mean, am I praying for the radical fall of the internet? Yes. You know what I mean? I mean, online pornography has created a psychosis in this culture. And we've got to begin being honest about it. Do I have a responsibility to demand that women step up to make other women feel safe? Yes. I saw a woman today on Facebook, a woman artist castigating Lena Dunham for somehow not being a good woman. And I felt enraged. I am so tired of women turning on other women for not doing it right, which is a result of our culture of misogyny, right? In the wake of motherless website, this is what's got you in a fluff? a smart, generous, artistic woman thinking about what it might mean to be who you are in this culture, that's got you upset. So I think right now my job is to protect and create zones of safety for other women and to hold the men in my life accountable that they're standing up. My daughter has just written a piece she sent me just before this show began. She's also a writer, and she was saying, she had written a book about the divine masculine and inviting men into other versions of the divine masculine, to look at Dionysus, to look at many of these other figures, and to recompost our ideas of masculinity. It's a very generous, beautiful book, and a lot of men have loved it. And she said right now she disavows it because men are using it to reinforce their boy groups. Let there be no more boys clubs. I don't want to hear about men getting together without an old grandmother present. That's it. Bottom line. Don't tell me you're doing your men's movement work and they always become toxic. So let the grandmothers step up and hold the boys accountable. There's a moment when you're a mother and you say, everybody go to their room. There will be no dessert tonight. I will be in to talk with you in an hour when you have had some time to think about things. I'm not worried about the male loneliness epidemic. I'm worried about the psychotic pornography that has literally changed the white matter in the brains of men. Okay? What are we going to do about that? And I have a son. I have friends with sons. I have a lot of men in my life. When your son's a teenager, will you talk with him about sex in ways that may make him uncomfortable? I hope so. I sure did. And I didn't do it just with my son. I did it with his friends, and I did it with my daughter and her friends. I took these 13-year-old girls and told them they had a right to sexual pleasure, and they should never, ever not do anything that didn't feel absolutely delightful and wonderful. They should never devote themselves to pleasing someone else. They all remember this conversation. My job is to be absolutely fearless in the face of this catastrophe we're inside of. But we got to keep people safe.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I guess it relates back to, well, I'll just say this, that I I feel as though they're the the reason that these men's groups exist, right? There's the whole manosphere thing happening, the documentary film on the manosphere. There's the alpha male groups that are getting together. These are examples of sort of extreme masculine embodiment groups, and I do know that there are other men's groups out there that are trying different ways. And part of me feels like if I respond with contempt towards them, that it further alienates them, and that the radical position is to extend compassion and understanding and create an opening for them to feel the mothering, versus feeling the boundary. And that's not to say that boundaries aren't important when there is a direct threat of harm, but that's, I guess, what comes up when I hear you talk about that. And I wonder if how you feel about extending compassion, um, to the men's groups.
I've been married for 33 years, and I'm the mother of a 29-year-old. I have a lot of men in my life, but I don't stand for bullshit. And I'm not responsible for caretaking someone's precious ego. And that's why the men in my life show up. I'm a pretty ferocious mother. I demand a lot of my children, and I have demanded a lot of them in the world. I will not stand for bad behavior. And if it upsets you, I'm throwing a pretty good party. My party includes art and sex and laughter and joy and dance and love and everything you've ever needed and wanted. Your party includes isolation and rape, the eating of babies, the rape of women. That's the party. Which party do you want to be part of? You want to be in your bunker with the boys? You want to come dance with me under the moonlight? You know,
Yeah. No, that's powerful.
I am no, uh, I'm throwing a party. Dionysus is there's a marvelous book right now called I cannot speak enough for this writer who I love with my whole being. Her name is Natasha Pulley, and she writes these incredibly wild books, and the most recent one is called The Hymn to Dionysus, and it's a retelling of the Bacchae from Dionysus's point of view. You know, the Bacchae, the story that we get about Dionysus inciting women to go mad, is from a male perspective. These women were women who were enslaved in a patriarchal culture that Dionysus liberated. What does that story look like when it's told from the women's point of view? And the story is what happens when we all begin to. And here's the thing: I told my son, if your partner is enjoying sex, you will enjoy sex, and everybody will enjoy sex, and the sex will be better, and you'll keep having great sex. So this is the formula you want to work with. You know what I mean? Like, you know what I'm going to tell you? We need to talk. We need the grandmothers in the room talking with these boys about what good sex really is. What good sex is not what you're seeing about suffocating girls. You know, what's the thing? 85% of young women have experienced strangulation as part of their first sexual encounter. We need to know these statistics as grandmothers, and we need to talk about them directly and frankly and unabashedly with young men. And if it scares them and freaks them out and they think I'm Baba Yaga, that's just fine with me. The soup is terrific. I'm having soup. Enough. I am fed up with male preciousness.
Yeah, it's a complicated yet very clear um, problem
When my
that
son went out on a date, I wasn't worried about his safety. When my son went out on a date, I was not worried about his physical safety. Every time my daughter went out on a date, I have to know who she's meeting, where she's meeting, what their name is, what they look like, and I have to think about if she's gonna come home safely. Every time. That's a phenomenal difference.
yeah.
Men are worried about their egos, women are worried about their lives. In that respect, talking about gender does matter in our culture at this particular
Mhm.
moment.
I think gender is still an important part of the conversation, even though, many people say it's a construct, there's there's too many things that are in stereotypical ways, but there are too many things that fall in line with the gender binary that are important to understanding what's going on, why it's going on, and what the solution should be, I think. And I think it's important too when we can say, like
I
you
mean,
describe in your book, we mentioned it, we sort of alluded to it earlier, the moment of rock climbing and how that young rock climbing instructor was one of your greatest mothers. And I
yeah, in the book I
said I
write
was
about.
gonna ask you to tell that story, if you wouldn't mind sort of elaborating on that a little bit.
Well, in my 20s, like a lot of us in our 20s, because we're taught to kick children out of the nest, right? That's what we're supposed to do. That's what we should do if we're good parents, is kick them out of the nest. And in fact, kids don't want that. They want to return home these days, which is terrific. Both my children returned home after college, and it was a really important retransition. Both my children and my grandchildren now live within 5 minutes of me. And we're a resource. We're each other's best friends, and we're each other's greatest resources. We're a community unto ourselves. That's what we want, and it's what a lot of parents want and what a lot of kids want, and they don't dare want it against the culture, right? But I'm sorry, I lost my train of thought. The rock climber. So in
Yep.
my 20s, I was lost. I was completely rudderless, shipless. I was living in Manhattan. I was going to graduate school. Um, I don't know who I was, where I belonged, what I wanted, who I needed. So what I did is I went to the family religion, which was psychoanalysis, which, trains me to identify all the ways my mother fucked up. So at the very moment where I needed to be feeling my root systems, my mother's, my grandmother's, I was being deracinated from my root system. So in fact, the feeling is that I feel worse and worse and worse and don't understand why. Right. And I'm feeling worse and worse. And I suddenly made a decision in the midst of all this to go. I heard about this wilderness survival trip. I went on, wrote an essay to get a scholarship, and I got a scholarship to go on this, wilderness survival trip for 6 weeks in North Carolina, which I did. And, and I wasn't a particularly athletic person before I began this experience. So I was really, why, they said you had to be able to run 4 miles when you got there. And even that took me like months of training to get there. Um, and I hadn't really thought it through. And it was a sort of extraordinary experience. It was a group of men and women that ranged in age from 22 to 55. I think it was about 15 men and women. And we had two instructors, a man and a woman, not related to each other. And for each of our adventures, there were often other instructors. But the first thing that we were asked to do was one of the first things was to rock climb. And I hadn't really taken in my fear of heights. I have a terrible fear of heights, a psychotic fear of heights. I mean, I'm really frightened of heights. I think it's an inner ear thing, whatever. It's just a thing. I really don't like heights. And so, we did some bouldering, which was bad enough, but I kind of got through it. And then it came time to do this rock climb. We climbed up this mountain. We got to this rock face overlooking this vast valley. And there was a young rock climbing instructor, a young man, probably about 22. And, he was teaching everybody everything and the past couple of days. And everybody sort of scrambles up the mountain. And I'm the last one left. And I want to go. I don't even like standing on the ground where we are. I don't want to much less go up this rock face. And I got about halfway up and I lost it. I had a full out panic attack. And I wasn't somebody who cried. I wasn't somebody who lost it. I was raised by a British mother not to cry. So, but I lost it and I couldn't move. I couldn't go up. I couldn't go down. And they wouldn't let me go up or down. And I really, really, I wanted to have a heart attack and have a helicopter come in and take me to safety. That was the only fantasy that I could imagine at that moment. And I was so scared and so helpless. And this young man who was above me, belaying me, everybody was sort of cheering me on. You can do it. You come on. You can do it. And which just made everything feel worse because I felt like I couldn't do it. And this young man waited till there was absolute silence. And he was way above me. And I looked up at him and he looked at me and he said, "Let go." I said, "What?" He said, "Take your hand off the rope." I was clinging to this rope, clinging to the rope. He said, "Take off one finger. Take off another." He guided me to opening my right hand. He said, "Now take your left hand. I'm going to hold you. You're going to let go, but you can let go because I'm holding you. I'm not going to let you go." And there was something about his manner and his confidence and his quiet and his patience. There was no rush, no urgency. He just waited for me to take one and I let go of my hand. He said, "See, I've got, I'm not going to let you fall." I said, "No." And I waited and he said, "Now climb." And he climbed up that rock. I think it took me another hour. And he asked everybody to be quiet. Didn't say a word. And the amazing thing is I remember when I got to the top, I just collapsed in tears. I think there were tears that I hadn't cried my whole life that I cried. And everybody kind of was congratulating me on having done this incredibly hard thing. And I looked to thank him and he was gone. He was done for the day. He got me up the rock. He went off for a beer. But I've never forgotten him. I don't even know his name. And I've never forgotten that moment. It's that umbilical moment. We talk about letting go, but you can only let go when you know that someone else is holding on to you. And I think that's what the mother does. The mother's umbilical cord, that belay rope that is love, says, I'm not gonna let you fall. I'm gonna hold you. You gotta climb the rock, but I'm gonna hold you. And yeah, it was incredible. But I've been mothered by so many beings. I count among my great mothers many men. And that's the thing. And there are many men who are wonderful mothers. And there are women who are wonderful mothers. And there are animals who are wonderful mothers. And trees. And many of us feel mothered by our animals. But there's no soul on the other side who isn't a mother. Not one.
This is a question that comes to mind just thinking, reflecting on thoughts of some men in my life, and not my husband. I often call him out, but I'm not talking about him. Um, but and it doesn't have to be men necessarily, but it could be men or women that haven't been mothered well. And so how do you learn to mother if you haven't been mothered well yourself? And
Yeah,
I know from the stories of your own
that's
mother.
yeah.
Yeah. But I just because to me what keeps coming through is how, some people learn by example. So hearing the examples that you talk about are very powerful, but just any information to somebody who's maybe not connecting to their own ability to mother.
Okay. It's always the same formula, and everybody wants to make it more complicated. Everyone wants to imagine there's a secret handshake. The dead are real. All the dead remember they have been your mothers. They will come when you call, but you gotta call. How do we mother ourselves? I remothered myself in the dark, lying in the family bed with 2 children, overworked, exhausted, not sure how to pay the bills, not sure how to show up. My demented mother was living with us. I was so overwhelmed, I couldn't stand it, and I began calling out for help in the dark to the dead, and I began experiencing them, not as showing up as voices or apparitions in my room, but as offering me help. An unexpected check in the mail, a bill lower than I thought it was gonna be, a sudden moment of ease. Uh, I began experiencing help, and what we want is to know go outside. I mean, this is the work I do. I teach a year-long course for students of people who studied with me on a year of living with the dead, remothering with the dead. 6 months in, there's still people who are having trouble asking the dead for help. There's a famous apparition of, the Madonna, the Blessed Mother, in the Rue du Bac in France in 1830, and she appears to a young nun called Catherine Labarre. She appears as a giant vulva, by the way, um, you know, just to have fun, but anyway, she appears, and Catherine at one point notices that the Blessed Mother has rings on her fingers, and from some of those rings are coming rays of light, but many of the rings have no light coming from them. And Catherine asked her, she says, "Why do some rings have light coming from them, but most of your rings do not?" And she says, "Those are all the blessings people do not think they're worthy to ask for. Those are all the blessings people do not think they are worthy to ask for. People are terrified to ask for help." from the dead. What we need to remember, and then my book goes into this, is during the European Gynocide, that 200-year period that precedes the age of capitalism, women were murdered across the most educated zones of Europe. And the thing they were most often tortured and murdered for was for speaking to the dead. Not for being midwives, not for doing herbalism, which was included, but for calling on their grandmother for help. We're going to the graveyard and saying, "Mama, can you help me? Can you protect me?" In order for us to treat the earth like it's inert, like it's a material object we can mine and destroy, we had to first silence the voices of the dead. And in order to colonize women, we had to separate them from the succor and solace of the dead on the other side. The only way to get the mothering we need at this point is with the help of the dead. Now, I will say that I work with people doing this. You don't need to work with me. You can take what I've told you and run with it just like I did. But if you do it, if you begin to do it, people's lives change. Like, I had this woman, she studied with me for a long time. She was a insurance executive in West Virginia, okay? All of a sudden, as she starts, working hard in her life, and suddenly, all of a sudden, she begins to realize the flowers are speaking to her. And I mean really speaking to her. And she feels like she can hear them. And she is feeling like the world is alive. And she suddenly knows what to do with her family and her life, and she's written a book about it, and it's coming out from a major publisher next year, and she's ecstatic, and she's joyous, and she's alive. The antidote to fear is faith. The antidote to fear is faith. The antidote to the economy of money is the economy of prayer.
Another helpful way I found from your books, in addition to like the specificity of working with the dead, but also that even when these beings were here in physical form and maybe not living a life where you would ask them for guidance because they didn't have it together, right? That now that they're in the spirit world, they have different perspectives. And I feel like that shifts a lot.
Uh,
You have that understanding.
when people ask me, who do I call on for help? And, why can't I just call on the dead generally for what's best for me? Well, I don't want to be called on generally for what's best for me, for my children. I want to be called for the chicken recipe or for, tell me, don't say, Mom, I need money. Say, tell me how much money you need and what for. And I'll decide whether or not I'm going to give you it. Right. So you better be specific. Um, but we've forgotten that sometimes failure is a great teacher. A Mozart is born a Mozart, and he's writing concertos at age 4. But how many lives did he spend not even able to sing on key? How many lives did he spend silenced? How many? We don't know. We don't, failure. Samuel Beckett, the playwright, once said, fail, fail again, fail better. That the course of life is often our greatest teacher is failure. And we don't learn except if we fail really spectacularly. And what do we do with lives that seem to be nothing but failure? I use often the example of my best friend's mother growing up was a beautiful woman and a talented woman, smart, funny, but life dealt her a series of really horrible experiences, and she ended up one of the worst alcoholics I've ever known. And people would say, when Rita hits rock bottom, she'll get sober. Well, rock bottom was dying at age 54 in an SRO with vodka bottles everywhere. When I wanted to get sober from sugar, I called on Rita. She came in like that. She said, I know what it looks like to not get sober. Believe me, I will be your sobriety buddy. What's one of the most amazing things is that her son wrote me out of the blue about a year after I started working with her. And he said, I read your book, and I want to say that people think my mom's life was a waste. But there is no one who comes faster than when I call on her from the other side. And I said, I know, because I call on her every day. Her life was not a waste. Her life as hard and terrible as it was, she is a mighty soul. We have no idea what lives mean or what we're looking at. You know, my husband once wrote about a man in Woodstock who many people dismissed as a homeless, crazy man. And he wrote a beautiful essay called 13 Ways of Looking at a Madman. He was the most generous, wise person in Woodstock. We don't know what we're looking at. That's why I want to see with the eyes of the dead while I'm still alive.
Mm-hmm. Your book has so many of these beautiful stories that bring this to life. And then between the different parts of the book, you have these what I'm calling interludes where you write messages from the mothers from different perspectives. I wonder if you could talk about that a little bit and where those messages came from, how they came to you.
So I kind of thought I knew what this book was about and what it was going to look like. And I thought there were going to be these historical scientific episodes that I was going to write from a more distanced, you know what I mean, a more authoritative academic, because I do a lot of academic research. And I really, you know, I'm not just pulling this out of my butt. I really do read a lot and study a lot. So I wanted to let people know that. But I sold the book and I had 9 months to write it. And that's fast. And I would take myself out every morning to walk up Mount Guardian, which is my favorite mountain here. And it's a beautiful mountain. It's very steep at the beginning. And I think because of that, a lot of people don't walk it. So I was always alone on the mountain. And I would talk to the mountain and I'd ask her what I needed to write that day. And I usually found that I had a sense of what to write as I finished my hike. And I'd come home and write. And about a month into this process, the mountain herself began to speak to me, as surely as the flowers began to speak to my friend. And I call them the old ones, the mothers before civilization, but I'm not sure they're human. I'm not sure I always know who they are. I know I feel them. I feel their presence very powerfully. And I realize I began to be a vehicle for them. When I turned the book in, my editor said, "Boy, your writing's really changed." I said, "Is that okay?" He said, "Wow, keep doing it, girl." I said, "Well, it's not my writing. I'm just showing up."
Mhm.
Really, it was an extraordinary experience. The messages would come through. I don't even know how to describe it, except that the mountain, I'd walk the mountain, I'd come home and I'd write one,
Mhm.
and they pour through me.
Yeah.
But you know, to receive that message, I'd been trusting the dead for a long time,
Mhm.
and I'd been writing for a long time. So they used me.
Mhm. Yeah. Beautiful.
There's one maybe last because I know we're reaching, a time where we've been talking for over an hour now, but there was one other part of the book that just struck me. It's when you're talking about fretting, and as I wasn't a fretter until I had a child, um, but I really
Oh no.
appreciate the visualization that it conjured for me when you talked about fretting and really how it's like a form of prayer. And so if there's anything that you wanna share about that, I would love to hear.
I'm an Olympic class warrior. Like, I'm a warrior. And my worry is my prayer. It's everything I care about, everything I'm concerned about. And we imagine that the life should be lived without worry, right? I'm going to go to a Zen monastery and I'm going to let go of all my worries. And that is usually men who left their wives and put their children up in the cabin with a babysitter. That was usually me. Um, and in fact, worry is care. And I use the word fret. I fret. I begin my mornings fretting. And I fret about my body. I've developed a tick-borne disease I have to deal with. I have to fret about that. I have to fret about the fact I'm growing older, and I've got things I have to check on and keep an eye on. The dentist, I have to fret about the dentist. I have 2 kids. There are 9 million things to fret about your children, and let me tell you, as they get older, it gets worse because they start driving cars, and
Mhm.
they start having bank accounts, and they get involved with the wrong people, and then they get involved with the right people, but man, you hope they don't screw it up, and you know what I mean? Like, and we have houses. We worry about our houses. We fret about our houses. We fret about our cars. We fret about our communities. They want to cut down 200 trees in Woodstock. I'm fretting. I'm fretting about everything. Um, our leaders want to use nuclear weapons. I'm fretting. But the word fret is also a word that means to spin wool into thread. It's that gesture of fretting that we do when we make music with a fret on a guitar, right? We pull on something. We pull the strings to make music, and we pull the thread to bind us to each other. Fretting creates a web of care and concern. Now, the problem only becomes when we don't know what to do with our anxieties and concerns. What I do with them in the morning is I turn them over to mothers on the other side. Every one of them. I turn over everything to someone on the other side. And if anything comes up, I turn it over. I turn it over. I start the day giving over my worries to those on the other side. I also start saying thank you to those who show up, and I don't have to worry about this anymore. Yay.
Mhm.
Um, and so the idea that I can let go without feeling someone else holding on, you can only let go of the worry if you feel like somebody else has got you. So you need to know that feeling that you're held. And to worry and care, everyone's taking anti-anxiety medicine in our culture. And I am really concerned about it. I think we should be a lot more anxious than we are, right? And we should learn to know what to do with our anxiety. And we should learn how it's fuel, it's energy, it's awareness. How much of our anxiety is intuition that we're being asked to silence? So I fret, but I have help. And that's the magic I talk about. The magic I talk about is that radical sense of belonging and care and joy of the team I've got beneath me, behind me, holding either hand. That's the fun part. That's when we can start to dance and have fun.
I had saved a quote from your book when you were talking about fretting. I'll just share it now. You wrote, "My fretting weaves me into an experience of belonging. That belonging itself is the answer to so many of our prayers. And when we belong again to the eternal circle of mothers, when we feel mothered and loved and seen and known by all that is, only then can we become the mothers the world needs us to be."
Yeah. Yeah. We can't give what we don't have, but we can have it in a moment. There are enough mothers to go around.
Well, I'm so grateful for your time, Perdita, and for you writing this book and inspiring so many beautiful thoughts and, offering some really powerful medicine that the world, I think, is in need of right now. And I'm excited for
I
it
hope
to
so.
make its way into the world.
Thank you so much, Teresa, and thank you for helping it get out there, and thank you for being the mother of his son, and thank you, Jennifer, for being here. Here's the thing. There's so many good folk in the world, you know? And if we begin to call on the dead as well, I think this is a moment of real transformation and change that's possible. I can feel it, can't you?
Yeah,
Yeah.
I do. I think, and I think that people are ready for it. I think that I I'm a mere 52 years old, so I haven't lived through some of the really ugly parts of history, but it feels like we're in a place right now, we're in a big crisis, and it seems to me that people want it now. They want the medicine, they want the mothers, they want the support, um, and so that gives me hope.
I think we see it. Yeah, it does give me hope too, and I think they want something else. I think if I have a prayer right now, if I could end with a prayer,
Yeah.
because I believe that prayers cast out words cast out are spells that matter, and we need mother spells in the world right now. Right now, the people who hurt people feel like they're in charge. The hurters are in charge. The fearful and the hurters. And I'd like to see the helpers. We want the helpers. That's why the pit has been so successful, right? Because all people want is what they call what? Competency porn. They want to see people helping other people. Like that's the medicine to pornography is people helping other people. And so I want like think about how many images of those men on the pit helping other people have become like the sex symbols, right? Like, oh my God, how do we reward the helpers instead of giving $50,000, sign-on bonuses to ICE agents? Can't we give $50,000 sign-on bonuses to teachers and nurses and doctors and tree planters and farmers and people just trying to do good works and artists and I really want to see I want to see helping become sexy again. Maybe that's my prayer is let's make helping sexy again.
Amen.
Amen.
Thank you, Perdita.
Yes, thank you, Perdita.
Thank you. Thank you so much.